YouTube and RSS from the Podcast Show 2023, the latest from podnews.net with supporting cast trusted by the biggest names to sell podcast subscriptions. We start with an exclusive today. Pod News has obtained a document with full details of a YouTube RSS ingestion pilot that it's running with some partners. The service pulls new audio from an RSS feed to upload it to YouTube, complete with a static image of the show art. Shows already using it are CNN's One Thing and CityCast Pittsburgh. Unlike other RSS-based podcast platforms, though, YouTube will not offer pass-through. The RSS feed is just a way to automatically ingest the audio once to their systems. Your hosting company cannot see how many times a podcast episode was listened to on YouTube, the company says, because all podcast content on YouTube is hosted on YouTube. Also, YouTube requires that podcasts must not contain any ads. The company requests feeds to be ad-free. Elsewhere, The Ben Shapiro Show and other Daily Wire podcasts will be distributed on Twitter, the company has announced, after success with one of its shows. The Podcast Show 2023 in London has kicked off. I was the first speaker, highlighting that the industry should focus more on engagement and time spent listening to grow podcasting and defend the unique nature of podcasting. BBC Sounds has announced a set of new shows and that the BBC is to work with Spotify's Megaphone to recommend relevant content to audiences on other platforms in the UK. The deal means that Spotify's Megaphone will programmatically schedule trailers for UK listeners on BBC shows carried on third-party platforms. The BBC's confirmed to Pod News that this doesn't affect the BBC's deal with Acast for monetising their shows outside the UK. The second annual Clue Awards, dedicated entirely to excellence and responsible storytelling in true crime content, is open for submissions. You've until July the 31st to enter. In France, Acast has signed the independent video game publisher Ubisoft. How will AI transform the podcast industry? Maxime Piquet, the CEO of OSHA, suggests it's possible to use AI in every step of podcast creation. Stephen Goldstein has reviewed the New York Times' new NYT audio app. Eva Gonzalez has written about the successful Outlier Podcast Festival, which took place last weekend. And a new podcast data website has been launched, which will allow users to query the podcast index in a user-friendly way with extra data, says the website owner, Benjamin Bellamy. And in tips and tricks today, Apple Podcasts has separate editorial curation for more than 170 countries across the world. But how can you see what they're promoting in other countries? The podcast growth agency Bumper has worked out a way of quickly seeing the contents of every country's Apple Podcasts front pages. This podcast is sponsored by Supporting Cast. What do Sony, Pushkin, APM, Slate, WNYC Studios, Savage Lovecast, Q-Code and Tenderfoot TV have in common? Well, they all rely on Supporting Cast to sell podcast subscriptions. Find out more at supportingcast.fm. And that's the latest from our newsletter. To read all the stories and subscribe, we're at podnews.net.